Prince Rupert to the railroad system in Canada, we could then move Alaskan commodities all the way into the Midwest, the industrial belt, and be able to use those mineral commodities to do value-added and reindustrialize the nation. 1/4 of all the oil and gas left undiscovered in the world exists right here in the Arctic Circle. That's the estimate. Alaska has hundreds of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Now think about the North Slope of Alaska, which is right here where our oil and gas is. Now think about us moving oil and gas through an empty Arctic. The Arctic Sea is almost to the point where we can start to move freight from Europe to North America across the pole. Think about it. Instead of bringing freight from Europe to the United States, this distance, 1/3 of the way around the world, we can shorten that distance to 1/4 of its distance and move freight directly in to Northern Europe and into their rail systems, connecting into their commodity flow, or into Russia and Asia, jumping over the poles with our freight, not just in the air, but in the sea. This will change everything and puts Alaska in the most strategic place because commodities are equal in price no matter where they're produced. The differences then become how cheap is it to get it to the next point. So we need rail to get it into the Midwest of the United States, where then it has the opportunity of being exported off of our western ports or through the St. Lawrence Seaway or off of our eastern ports, or we have the option in the not-too-distant future of shipping direct into these markets, raw goods, or adding value here in Alaska. Alaska has the greatest energy resources. All these minerals require energy for value added, and we have the opportunity to do that now. Now, what would that mean? If we began to move these commodities and these energy resources in the United States, half of our trade deficit is energy related, and the other is buying value-added products back from China. If we could eliminate 50% of our trade deficits by eliminating imported energy, we strengthen the dollar again. We reinvigorate our economy again. We now have a domestic supply of energy, and we keep our money rolling in our own economies. The same is true with value added to our commodities. We have an opportunity to take a big chunk of our economy back from the rest of the world, embed it back into our nation, and use the advantage that we have. Alaska is the stepchild. Recognize our state. Recognize this place as an incredible opportunity for Americans to be liberated by looking at the balance sheet. Think about it. We always talk about the profit and loss statement, the income and expenses of the nation when we talk about the debt and how we're going to fix it. It's always about the taxpayer and putting it on our backs. The balance sheet are the assets of the nation, which includes our energy resources, our mineral wealth, our force, our public lands. How do we make them pay in a way that offsets the Treasury demands against the taxpayer? Get full value for our commodities. Make sure those multinationals pay money here, because here's what happens, and we play it out in Alaska every year. Here we have oil and gas that the nation needs, and we have a pipeline that can run it down to Valdez, and the pipeline is running at 616,000 barrels a day today. It's designed to handle 2.1 million barrels. Why aren't we moving U.S. oil through a U.S. pipeline? Is because it's cheaper to corrupt a third world government somewhere else on the planet, keep the oil and gas in the ground in the U.S., because a multinational doesn't have any care about our national needs or our national priorities. It's about the bottom line. If it were a national oil company that cared first about the national priorities, then that oil and gas would be developed, would be feeding U.S. markets, even if it cost a little more, because the offset is U.S. jobs, U.S. taxes generated, U.S. rollover in our economy of every one of those dollars spent domestically 7 times. A 7 times multiplier in the economy and the tax base when we spend money at home. That's the difference. Bring it back because it's a domestic priority, not a multinational priority. Our domestic priorities need to carry forward, or these companies that are retaining these rights need to be put under performance. You know, these leases on the North Slope don't require any performance. They hold them, they pay the fee, they don't have to ever produce them. In Russia, if you didn't produce, you lost your right. Later they took them anyway, but at least they had the incentive. You're going to spend the money, you're going to produce these fields, or you're out of here. So they did. In the U.S., we don't make them produce anything. We just give them the right to tie up the public resource, call it their safety deposit box in our safe economy, because our men and women are defending this turf to defend them, to save their bacon after we're done trying to save it from whatever third world country they've corrupted. They always can come back home and produce it domestically. And by then, they've screwed us down so much on the royalties and taxes under the guise of, well, if it's not cheap enough, we'll do it elsewhere. We understand all that. We know how economics works. We know how capitalism works. But we also understand how our national interests work, and multinational companies don't, because they don't care. It's not in their self-interest to care. They're looking at the 6 billion other consumers that don't live here, who are their potential future markets, because this economy, from their perspective, doesn't have those opportunities. It's dead. They want to go where people are changing from bicycles to automobiles, and that's the rest of the world. People have asked me, about my father. He was lost on a plane with Hale Boggs in the early 70s. Hale was a majority leader at the time. I mean, you can look at all of the interesting coincidences. The guy that took Hale Boggs to the airport, he was working in Texas at the time for another campaign, and Boggs got a ride to the airport by a young Democrat from Oklahoma, William Jefferson Clinton. Yeah, the same one that later became president. Now, this is 1972. Now, Boggs gets on the plane, he goes to D.C., makes a connection to Alaska, comes to Alaska, gives a speech, breaks the story a little bit about what was coming. We didn't know, it wasn't known as Watergate then, it was just this big scandal that he mentioned. And the next day he gets on a plane flying to Juneau from Anchorage and disappears and never heard from again with my father. Now, Boggs was on the Warren Commission. He wanted the Warren Commission reopened. It was saying so around that time. 6 months before, he had called for the resignation of Hoover, who he believed absolutely corrupt. Because of his own perversions, Hoover's, he used knowledge to blackmail the Congress. He had the inside track on every congressman because he had tapped their phones, intercepted their mail, basically violated all their personal privacy rights. And this was the leadership of the country, for goodness sakes. This is our entire Congress that he corrupted so that he could maintain his position in the FBI. Boggs wanted him out. Boggs came to Alaska. By then, Hoover was gone, but the plane disappears, the Hoover administration continues, the Warren Commission never reopens, and Watergate breaks 3 weeks later. October 16th, 1972, the plane goes down. McGovern's in his last throes of his death race because he isn't winning anything. Richard Nixon's the clear winner. Everybody knows it. Hale Boggs is a majority leader of the House, standing in line to be the next speaker, the third most powerful position in the Congress. And what happens? He disappears at the most critical time in our history. In fact, if you remember, what happened right after Watergate broke and then Agnew got bounced, as the vice president? Ford slid in behind him. Nixon resigns. Ford moves up. Ford pardons Nixon, and Rockefeller rolls in as the vice president. And then, if you remember, it was, I think it was Squeaky Fromm, wasn't it Squeaky Fromm? It was one of the Manson girls that takes a pot shot at Ford to knock him off because she wanted him dead, and who would have been president? Rockefeller. Now, isn't that interesting? Talk about conspiracy theory. How about conspiracy reality? That's how it played out. Everybody's forgotten it. If you're not 50, you don't remember. But a lot of us remember when all this happened. And it played out. Now, Boggs is off the scene. Carl Elbert is the speaker. Carl was an alcoholic. He's come to my house all the time, talked to my dad. The guy could barely sit on a bar stool, and he was Speaker of the House. Those were the days when you got stopped by the police for drunk driving, and they said, hey, drive on home and sleep it off. It was a different world. in a different era. But Carl Elbert was not in a position at that time to step into the President of the United States. What I think would have happened had Boggs lived, Carl Elbert would have stepped down, Boggs would have stepped up, they would have got rid of Agnew and Nixon at the same time, and the third in line to be president would have been, and that would have been Hale Boggs, and the whole game would have changed in this country. And personal freedom and liberty would have been restored then, instead of going into disrepair even further now. Now, Dad brought Boggs to Alaska to campaign. Dad had that campaign in the bag. He brought him here to show him, to talk about the same issues, many of the same issues that we've talked about over this video. The idea that Alaska has this tremendous potential for the United States that ought to be realized. This was right before the native land claims, the biggest settlement in indigenous history in the United States. As a freshman congressman, my dad got passed a 44 million acre land transfer to indigenous people intact with mineral rights, oil and gas rights, energy rights, timber, surface estate, water rights, everything intact. And they moved that over along with just under $1 billion in 1971, the first year he was a member of Congress as a freshman. Now, people say freshmen can't get anything done. I know personally they're wrong. My brother Mark is a freshman senator, 2 years in the job. He's the fifth-ranking Democrat in the U.S. Senate and the only member of the U.S. Senate without a college degree. He did it in 2 years because he knows how to work hard, stand for something, and do something. Now, Mark and I don't agree on everything, as brothers never do, but I can tell you this. He's as committed to public service as I am. We have a different way of expressing it. But his risk at getting something done is as greater as they've ever been. You know, when you think about congressional deaths, you think about my dad's, what happened is they found out in 1993 through FOIA requests that the military actually knew that my father or somebody at that crash site was alive. 2 people were alive, according to the FBI records that eventually got released. 2 people were alive at a crash site that has never been found. Crash site's never been publicly identified, nor has the people who were alive at that site. Lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. The documents we saw that Roll Call, prestigious publication in D.C., got under a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, all the key names were redacted. When we went after the data from the military, the Air Force overflights, the data that was developed for the biggest air and sea search in the history of the world, and all the records they told us were destroyed. A few months later, because we raised a lot of heck over that, a few months later, mysteriously on my brother's doorstep, a pile of boxes with all those original documents, not redated. Gee, they hadn't been destroyed at all. We'd been lied to again. I want to tell you, as the son of a United States congressman, that if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. That's why we need to get into this fight and engage our government. It shouldn't happen to anyone that our risk to our personal freedom, to our life, should be at risk as people give up their private life in order to carry on everyone else's. In the case of Wellstone, many remember his plane crash in Eveleth, Minnesota. It just happened to be the same town my dad was born in. My uncle was a mayor there, was a state legislature there. Coincidence? Kind of interesting. Do you remember Carnahan, the senator before him that died in Missouri? That was the anniversary date of my dad's disappearance, October 16th. Is it coincidence? Maybe so, but it certainly begs the question, how many people die in plane crashes? My brother beats Ted Stevens in an election. Ted Stevens dies in a plane crash a couple years later. What people don't remember is he was already in a plane crash before where his first wife was killed, died in a plane crash. People forget about it. Mike Gravel's wife died in a plane crash. People forget about it. People forget about all of this, and yet it keeps happening. And people say, well, politicians fly a lot. That plane crash is a little disproportionate to the rest of the population. How about business travelers? You want to talk about people flying a lot. It seems to be one of the hazards of the job.